From the campus of Yale University, this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, nationally syndicated across the country on the Biz Talk Radio Network, and coming to you from our flagship stations, Yale Radio WYBC and 1490 AM WGCH Greenwich. All talk and all business, 60 minutes of radio with leading figures from the world of business along with the business of politics and sports. What to do in the Middle East quagmire, a path forward for the new administration. That's today on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Aaron David Miller is Vice President for New Initiatives and a distinguished scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. For the prior 2 decades, he served at the Department of State as an advisor to Republican and Democratic Secretaries of State. Written a recent piece in Politico, Memo to the New President, Avoid the Vision Thing in the Middle East. It's co-written with Richard Sokolsky. He was a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace's Russia and Eurasian program, and he was a member of the Secretary of State's Policy Planning Office, that from 2005 to 2015. Welcome, Aaron.
Jim, it's a pleasure to be here.
So this interview, I think, has become even more interesting since we set it up before the election, and I think nobody expected that Mr. Trump would win. So before we start off, why don't you tell us what your role at State was in your background?
You know, I began life actually as an academic. I had a Ph.D. in Middle Eastern history from the University of Michigan, and wandered into Washington in the late 70s. Was interested in the Department of State and began my career as actually a State Department historian, became an intelligence analyst working on Middle East, particularly Lebanon and the Palestinians, and then in the early 80s worked for the policy planning staff. Then in 89, when Bush 41 and James Baker came in, things began to change, and for the next 15 years, I worked for a half a dozen secretaries of state, primarily on one issue, or one question, I should say. Could the United States facilitate, broker, create circumstances in which you could have an Arab-Israeli negotiation, Israeli-Palestinians, Israeli-Syrians, Israeli-Jordanians, leading to some sort of comprehensive peace? You can see how well we did there. But I've spent the last 13 years, and Colin Powell, who was the last Secretary of State I worked for, gave me 2 pieces of advice when I left in 2003. He said, don't try to come back, and don't try to look back. The comeback part I took. I'm not interested in running for anything. I'm not associated with anybody's campaign. The look-back part, however, I took seriously in terms of what I wanted to do, and that was to examine how and why the United States, at least in this region, found itself in such a difficult predicament, and in what circumstances we could, in fact, make a contribution. And I'd say at the outset, I haven't abandoned hope. I have 2 grown children, and I really don't have the right, frankly, to tell them that this won't happen or this is absolutely going to happen, but I have abandoned my illusions. And my op-eds, Washington Post, New York Times, my column in Foreign Policy, basically I would describe as annoyingly negative. But that characterization, frankly, is not driven by ideology or any particular bias. I'm with Groucho Marx here, who said in Duck Soup, I think while he was dressed as Harpo, who are you going to believe, Groucho said, me or your lying eyes? And I see what I see, which is a broken, angry, dysfunctional region in which the United States, I don't care whether it's a Republican president or a Democratic president, we are stuck in a Middle East that we cannot transform and we cannot leave. And that predicament, no transformation, no extrication, which is what confronted the last 3 presidents I worked for, and confronts Barack Obama until January, and will continue to confront the president-elect, is in fact the great question. If you can't transform and you can't extricate yourself for a great power, and let's be clear, we are still, despite all of our imperfections and the rising power of others, we are still the most consequential power in the international system today, with a better balance of military, political, economic, and soft power than any other country in the world, and we're likely to maintain that advantage for years to come. But what does a great power, stuck in a region it can't fix and it can't leave, do? I have some thoughts on that, but they are, again, as I think you'll sense, thoughts that tend toward the minimalist rather than the maximalist view.
And we're going to go through those as we go on. It's a fascinating but sober piece. But I want to start off with a little bit about what we think Mr. Trump's impact might be on the Middle East, and then we'll explore some of the personalities or some of the suggestions you have for what would make a good Secretary of State. First off, before you give an overall impact, it seems right off the bat we have a contradictory approach that would sort of disengage to a greater extent, but take out ISIS as well. Are those fundamentally incompatible? How do you see Trump's impact on the Middle East?
Well, I think part of the problem, as you gather, all presidents, I think Jonathan Alter once wrote, are blind dates. And to a degree, campaigning and what is said on the campaign trail, and even those initial appointments that are made, which could point significantly, as I think several of Mr. Trump's appointments do, point in a certain direction, campaigning is simply not governing. And when the rhetoric and proclivities and inclinations of a president-elect meet the realities of governance, there's an interesting dynamic. Sometimes those campaign principles ring true and hold true. And other times, in the face of reality and an unpredictable world, they change. So I guess I have a question, which I could try to answer. Is America first in the Middle East, which is Mr. Trump's mantra, is America first likely to produce a successful, risk-ready set of policies in the region, or a set of risk-averse policies in the region? And I think if you looked at campaign statements and the rhetoric of campaigning, it's not altogether clear. The fight against ISIS, which is going to be at the centerpiece, or the fight against what Mr. Trump refers to as radical Islam, is going to be a centerpiece of the new administration's policies, presumably, and its vocabulary. The current president's unwillingness to use the term radical Islam is going to be replaced by a whole new set of terms. And that conditioning and socialization process is going to have an impact in itself. But let's just take one concrete example. Currently, the United States is providing intelligence and air power in the service of primarily an Iraqi operation to liberate Iraq's second largest city, Mosul, from ISIS's grip. That offensive may come to an end, perhaps successfully. What happens afterwards is a key question. But the next offensive, the Raqqa offensive against the ISIS capital in Syria, will likely occur on Mr. Trump's watch. Mr. Trump has said clearly that he plans to cancel the CIA's billion-dollar assistance program to local groups, specifically the Syrian Kurds, and yet the Syrian Kurds constitute the bulk of the 30,000 forces that plan to take the Syrian ISIS capital at Raqqa. So how do you reconcile that contradiction? That may simply have to be adjusted in the face of reality. That's just one issue, I think, of many that are likely to be reviewed and revisited by the incoming administration.
Let me ask you a couple with just, you can do a quick response.
Sure.
Do you see him moving closer to Russia, who sort of aligns itself with Assad, to focus on ISIS?
I mean, I think there's absolutely no doubt that Mr. Trump is certainly going to test the proposition that the United States can find an effective way to cooperate with Mr. Putin. And I suspect that he may succeed on the question of coming up with a more effective military policy. It brings up a whole range of other questions, however, with respect to what is the future of Bashar Assad, how close is the United States going to get to a Russian client.
What about, will he tilting more then towards the Sunni states and Turkey maybe versus obviously maybe pulling out of the Iran nuke deal?
I don't think it'll be Sunni versus Shia so much as it'll be who is perceived to be an effective and consequential partner for the United States. On one hand, the Saudis are Sunni, and Mr. Trump has roundly criticized them as free riders. On the other hand, he apparently had a very warm conversation with the Iraqi Prime Minister yesterday.
Oh, interesting.
Prime Minister Abadi, who is a Shia, and he pledged support for the government of Iraq. So I think I'd be very wary here. Look, it's Forrest Gump's mother's line in that wonderful movie, life's like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. There's a certain element of that, and we need to understand that it's impossible to make ironclad and fast and hard predictions now.
You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell over the Business Talk Radio Network, 350 stations around the country. You can go to the website and see where the stations are, or listen to our podcast, or listen to that week's show over the Internet. And we'll be back. We'll look at potential State Department secretaries and what are the attributes that would enhance the chances of success. That'll be next. Stay with us. And we're back with former State Department official, Mideast expert Aaron Miller. You just went through what we were assessing were potential Trump actions in the Middle East. He's got to name a Secretary of State. Next, it may actually be named by the time this show airs, but you recently wrote about what you think are critical attributes that an effective Secretary of State needs to have. Go through those first, then we'll explore some of the candidates.
Number one, relationship with the president. I mean, Jim Baker, who I worked for in the late 80s, early 90s, used to say that he was the White House's man at the State Department, not the State Department's man at the White House. And the reality is a relationship with the president is critically important. The most consequential Secretary of State we've had in recent years, Henry Kissinger, James Baker, for example, had very close relationships. Kissinger, a complicated one with Nixon. Baker, a very close, extraordinarily close relationship with Bush 41. It's important because it takes about 5 minutes for an ally or adversary of the United States to determine whether or not the Secretary of State is speaking for the president or not. If the verdict is that person is not speaking for the president, or there's daylight between the two positions, then I think the room to maneuver of allies and adversaries increases. And
would that be Colin Powell, for instance?
Well, Colin Powell was involved in an interesting, intriguing situation, particularly with respect to the Iraq War. I mean, Powell was surrounded by a number of other very strong personalities, Condi Rice, Dick Cheney, Don Rumsfeld, who I think in many respects had a different view of some of these policy issues. And I think it was tougher for that particular secretary always to win Bush 43's confidence on a particular issue. When you are the nation's top diplomat, in the case of Bush 41 and James Baker, or in the case of Richard Nixon, and again, there were very unique circumstances that pertain to that, but Nixon gave Kissinger extraordinary leeway and support, and Bush gave Baker extraordinarily. There were few competitors. You were the repository of the president's confidence. There was very little infighting during those periods because the Secretary of State or the National Security Advisor, Kissinger held both roles for a brief period of time, were dominant. And the president makes foreign policy. The president is the commander-in-chief and the ultimate source of authority. But if you can empower an individual, let's say it's the Secretary of State, and it should be, frankly, then in fact that secretary can have a real advantage both in maneuvering in Washington, where a president will have the secretary's back, but more important, abroad, where people are looking very clearly and carefully at what is the relationship between these two individuals. So relationship with the president is critically important. Second is, can you negotiate? Not every Secretary of State gets involved in negotiations the way Kissinger and Baker got involved. But you need to have, in my judgment, the negotiator's mindset. And that is basically, the world is like an unassembled jigsaw puzzle on your living room floor. And there's no way to teach negotiations. I mean, these Baker and Kissinger were intuitive negotiators. They understood that how the pieces could potentially fit together, and they realized that they could harness the means available to bring those pieces together. They were extremely skilled. So having the negotiator's mindset and the flexibility and pragmatism while pursuing principles and objectives is critically important. Finally is the right persona, and I saw this up close with Baker, with whom I worked closely, particularly in the 9 months in 91 in the wake of the first Gulf War that it took the U.S. to put together the Madrid Peace Conference. Baker played so many roles. He was an actor. He was a confidant. He could be an intimidator. He was the repository of the confidences of allies. And that sort of role, that sort of larger-than-life role, the role you play on the diplomatic stage and the endurance and the perseverance to play that role, That's really important. Finally, no matter how brilliant a Secretary of State is, unless the world cooperates, that is to say, unless there are opportunities that are usually offered up beyond the capacity of the United States, or crises in which a Secretary of State is forced to try and diffuse, you don't have the role to play. So this time Karl Marx was right. He argued that men, he was right in the 19th century, make history, but rarely as they please. And the reality is, for any good Secretary of State, it's the persona of that secretary and the skill set of the secretary and a world that offers up opportunities to be exploited or crises to be diffused.
We got Karl Marx and Groucho Marx so far.
Yeah, I think about that every now and then, the Marx brothers.
Okay, now we've got names like Mitt Romney, Senator Corker, Governor Haley, and former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani. You can comment on if you think one or more are the best, but I'll ask two. In particular, Mitt Romney would not seem to meet your close relationship or a similar vision. And to me, Rudy Giuliani, who was a great mayor, doesn't fit a great diplomat.
Well, one of the survival rules in Washington, particularly during a transition, is to try to avoid speculating on appointments that have not yet been made. It's one of the reasons I've tried to identify the kind of person with the sorts of skills that are required to be the Secretary of State. So I really am now steering away at trying to figure out who would be best at winning the Secretary of State sweepstakes.
You would not feel comfortable even saying, well, I don't think this person is really a fit.
The reality is, let's just take brief comments on two sort of anomalies.
Okay.
Rudy Giuliani may well, among the candidates you mentioned, have the closest relationship with the president-elect. The question is, does he have the temperament and the skill set to do the job? Mitt Romney, on the other hand, for obvious reasons.
Interesting, yes.
It's a paradox. It doesn't have that kind of relationship with the president. It may, in fact, as you indicated, Jim, have a different view or vision of the world, and yet by temperament, you might be able to argue Mitt Romney's temperament might be better suited to the flexibility and pragmatism required to play the roles that I indicated. So that's just one. That's one example of a match and mismatch which exists in both of those
Fascinating,
candidates.
and we may have the answer by the time this airs, and we'll then be able to compare with what your notes were on what were the right things. Let's talk about a couple of bigger picture things before we finish this segment. The first off, you mentioned the Sunni Shia thing. To me, I see that as irreconcilable. Remember Daniel Patrick Moynihan saying we need a period of benign neglect and racial relations. Do we almost stop trying to figure that puzzle out?
I mean, I think I think we'll try to continue to figure it out because you've got regional conflicts that are partly driven. An example is the rise of Iran and a Shia state under this Iranian regime since the revolution. Under several Iranian regimes, a revolutionary ideology at home in an effort to export its influence abroad versus Saudi Arabia, the guardian of the holy places of Mecca and Medina in Islam, an exporter itself, frankly, of Wahhabist, Salafi radicalism, which, frankly, in many respects has close links in terms of ideology with the Islamic State. So that competition between a Shia Iran and a Sunni Saudi Arabia is driven, for sure, by the religious component, but far more compelling, I think, is to see it as a regional conflict between two states that are aspiring to maintain their own interests and extend their influence. We, the United States, are not going to find a way to deal with the sectarian and religious grievances and tensions between Sunnis and Shia.
And with apologies to David Letterman, we're going to next look into top 10 lists for dealing with the Middle East. That's coming next. And we're back with Aaron Miller. He has an article in Politico, Memo to the New President, Avoid the Vision thing in the Middle East, and we're going to talk about that. But before we do that, one more big picture thing. Nation building, is that definitely dead? Has General Petraeus' counterinsurgency strategy, which helped save Iraq at one point, are they dead?
Well, there are two separate points. I think the notion that the United States, let's take Iraq and Afghanistan, for example. We invaded Iraq in 2003 with insufficient forces, with a woeful misunderstanding of the nature of the Iraqi political system. We helped depose and bring to justice a very evil dictator, Saddam Hussein. But in the meantime, we dismantled the Ba'ath Party and the Iraqi military. And the standard for victory in Iraq, in my judgment, was never could we win, but when could we leave? And that sort of standard for the United States was virtually an impossible one to meet. So the notion that we are going to, even with preponderance of military power, going to restructure a society and wrestle with and unpack and resolve the problems of governance, sectarian identity, the debate within Islam, tensions between Sunni and Shia, guaranteeing the Iraqi coherence of the Iraqi government and its capacity to extend sovereignty over its own borders. This is virtually not only mission implausible, it's mission impossible. And that's why we are still involved in the two longest wars in American history that are going to drag on seemingly without end. So no, I do not believe, as Michael Mandelbaum has written in a recent book, in foreign policy as social work. The reality is we can barely help diffuse the dysfunction that exists here in the United States, let alone trying to run around the world trying to fix other people's broken houses. We have roles to play, but we are not the indispensable power in trying to address how to repair these kinds of questions that get cut to the core of society's national identities and ability to govern.
Okay, as we avoid this vision thing that you're calling for, we're going to look at some of the things you are calling for. And the first one's interesting because you already talked about with regards to how it will change with Trump, which is sort of purging the vocabulary. Tell us what you mean by that.
Well, I mean, I think we have to get look, U.S. credibility basically demands that we say what we mean and we mean what we say. When the gap between our own rhetoric and our capacity to achieve those goals widens, then American credibility falls in the middle. So I think we have to be extremely careful when we use words like indispensable power. What does it even mean that the U.S. is the indispensable power? You know, de Gaulle said, I think we say in the article, that the graveyards of France are filled with indispensable people. The reality is we cannot be expected to be the go-to power on every major international problem. We don't have the resources, we don't have the capacity, and in the Middle East, you know, the quote the words of a famous Lebanese historian, great powers meddle in the affairs of small tribes at their own risk. So we have to be very careful that we don't allow our rhetoric to go well beyond our capacity to carry it out.
Things like drawing a red line in Syria over the use of chemical weapons and in not following through the impact on our credibility. I want you to talk about that. And also, though, in the context of there's a moral question there, too, when you allow a guy like that to basically get away with it.
There is, and let's deal with the moral questions first, the ethical, humanitarian morality of what many of his critics, that is to say the current president's critics, believe is an abdication of American responsibility in Syria. You know, make no mistake, this is the largest single refugee flow since the end of the Second World War. 500,000 people have been killed. An entire society is traumatized. The deaths and trauma to tens of thousands of children and young adults. It'll take a generation or more for Syria to recover, if ever, frankly, from what's occurred. But it raises the question of when does the United States, despite all of its promotion of its values and its rhetoric, intercede in the face of mass killing, mass slaughter. If you look at the U.S. record, from the Nazi Holocaust to Cambodia to Darfur to Rwanda to Congo, with the possible exception of Bosnia, and there we interceded late, a curious fact, sad, tragic fact emerges, and that is our record on these humanitarian interventions is a poor one, and our rhetoric goes well beyond our traditional capacity to act. That's a whole other show, Jim, as to why that may be. Mm-hmm. But I think this is far more than an Obama problem. This is an American issue. And I'm not arguing, I'm not making the case, that we intercede in every humanitarian intervention, but there's a reason or an explanation as to why we've been reluctant. why presidents have been reluctant to get involved in these things. The red line, however, is a classic demonstration of what shouldn't be said by a president unless you're prepared to follow through. And whether or not enforcing the red line would have fixed the situation in Syria, I very much doubt whether it would have changed the battlefield dynamic. A few cruise missiles against Syrian airfields or command and control, unless we were prepared to follow through and stay the course with a growing direct military involvement, I don't think it would have changed the battlefield trajectory. The point is, it badly damages your credibility if, in fact, you say at least twice that a red line on the use of chemical weapons will cause me to change my calculations, and nothing is done. Now, the administration has argued that, well, but opportunity came because we ended up with an agreement with the Russians, which found a way to rid Syria of tons of chemical weapons. Not all, because they're still being deployed on the battlefield by the Assad regime and by the opposition, I might add. But it still doesn't answer the mail when allies and adversaries see the United States as not following through on what it says. We are perceived to be weak and feckless. And if you're weak and feckless enough times, guess what happens? You really aren't admired or respected in a region of the world where we need to be.
That leads right into where I want to go next, which is America's influence in the region in a major decline? Is this due to President Obama, like there's been some criticism?
Well, I see it. I try not to moralize here. I'm an analyst, not an advocate. The argument has been made that George Bush 43 was too risk-ready, particularly in Iraq. In response to that, Barack Obama became too risk-averse. And an argument can be made, I think, that both, in fact, are probably true. George W. Bush headed into Iraq without enough careful thought about the implications. Barack Obama got out of Iraq, probably prematurely, without thinking through the possible implications. And
announcing the date in advance.
Yeah, although that had a lot to do, I think, with that date, frankly, was a residual date from the Bush administration. Whether or not, had we stayed in Iraq for another 3 or 4 years with an additional 10,000 forces, it would have changed the fundamental equation on the ground. I doubt it, but it's a counterfactual, and there's no way to prove it. Mm-hmm. So the question is, to what degree is America responsible for the problems in the Middle East? I think we certainly bear a fair measure of responsibility for much of what has occurred there. But I'm telling you, on this one, I'm a fan of Michael Jackson. I won't sing it for you, but in one of his better songs, he's called "Man in the Mirror," and I'll paraphrase: "If you want to make a change in your life," he wrote, or someone wrote, "you have to the place to start is by looking in the mirror." And the reality is, you have a region that is broken, angry, and dysfunctional. It does not have the leadership necessary to rise above local, narrow, religious, political affiliations to think about the interests of their countries as a whole. It doesn't have the institutions that reflect the popular will and are legitimate and authoritative. These are problems that are virtually impossible for the United States to fix. We can assist, we can help, but the ownership, and let me close on this point. It was Larry Summers who said that in the history of the world, nobody ever washed a rental car. It's a profound piece of philosophy.
Interesting, yeah.
You don't wash rental cars because people care only about what they own. And it is the absence of ownership, in my judgment, more than any other single factor. Local ownership, whether it's the Israeli-Palestinian issue, whether it's how to deal with ISIS, whether it's how to delegitimize the Salafi jihadi terrorists that wreak havoc in the region in Europe and would like to do so here. It's the absence of local ownership. And frankly, I don't know how to fix that. The Middle East, unlike every other area of the world, seems to be falling farther and farther behind. Transparency, accountability, respect for human rights, gender equality, globalization. I worry greatly. And this is not just a headline, Jim. This is a trend line. We're going to be left with this problem for years to come.
Business Talk with Jim Campbell, coming to you from our flagship stations, Yale Radio, WYBC, and WGCH, Greenwich, Connecticut. We'll be back with our final national segment. And we're talking with Aaron Miller, former State Department official, here in our last national segment. Let me ask you this. Russia trying to, increase its presence in the Middle East, though, you may comment why he doesn't appear to have caught himself into a quagmire yet. But with Ukraine and the Syrian adventure by them, are we closer to reigniting the Cold War? Where does that status?
Look, the Cold War was a unique period in American history. Within that 60-year period, you had the real prospects for 12 days in October of 1962. I was only 12 at the time, but every American, I think, felt it, where you had a standoff in the Kennedy administration over Cuba, stationing of ICBMs 90 miles away from American shores. So, no, we're not going back to that kind of nuclear standoff. We're also not going back to an ideological clash between Russia and the United States. This is not a matter of communism versus democracy. These are two states that, frankly, in many respects have a lot in common, but are clashing in limited areas of the world with respect to how they both perceive and conceive their national interests, and particularly Vladimir Putin, who is determined to ensure that Russia protects its traditional interests and gains the recognition and respect that Vladimir Putin believes it deserves. So, no, I don't think we're going back to a nuclear international Cold War. At the same time, I can't remember when Russian-American relations were worse. I mean, you have credible reports of Russian hacking of American institutions. There was this huge presumption that, in effect, the election would be rendered somehow fraudulent because there would be an effort to do that on November 8th. You have the annexation of Crimea. You have Putin in eastern Ukraine. With respect to Putin, however, it's not as if he's overextended himself. He's been able, with limited investment, to achieve several things. Number one, he's blocked what America wants to do. He's created a clear situation that nothing in Syria will happen without Putin agreeing to it. And finally, he's prevented the United States from overthrowing, by military force, another Russian client. He watched Saddam Hussein goodbye. He watched Muammar Gaddafi and still resents the American intervention, which his president at the time, Medvedev, supported. Get rid of Muammar Gaddafi. He's determined not to allow the Americans to engineer Bashar Assad's removal. And frankly, let's be clear, he's succeeding. How many Americans are prepared to die in defense of Syria?
Would that also be attributable to Putin? Does he want to take us on? Is he just trying
He's already shown his willingness to deploy ground troops to make this investment. Northern Syria, and the Israelis are very concerned. Now, northern Syria now has advanced fighter aircraft and an advanced radar missile system that the Israelis are now arguing hamper their freedom of movement and maneuver. So do I believe that Putin is prepared to challenge American aircraft in that zone? I do.
Wow. As we draw the last couple of minutes in the national show, so you're talking about, we got to move beyond the vision thing and trying to be too idealistic, transform the Middle East. What do you think we should do?
I mean, we have three core interests, Jim. And I have to say, my critics, both the liberal interventionists on that side and the neoconservatives on the other side, fundamentally disagree with what I'm about to say. Number one, we need to protect the homeland. 9/11 is the second bloodiest day in American history, exceeded by only one other day, not far from where I'm talking to you now, in Sharpsburg, Antietam, in Maryland, where in September 1862, more Americans were killed in a single afternoon than another day in American history within the continental United States. And that threat is still very real. We don't need a world war over it. I do not believe Salafi jihadi terror represents a existential threat to the United States. I mean, between 2001 and 2014, I think 300 plus Americans were killed in terror attacks abroad. During the same period, 300,000 Americans were killed here at home in gun violence. I don't want to get into this whole argument, to go to war with the NRA or anyone else over the issue of the Second Amendment. I advance it to indicate a measure of perspective here. We have to, keep our heads on this. And we have to do it smartly. So do I believe that deploying thousands of American ground forces to Iraq and Syria or Libya is going to fix the problem of jihadi Salafi terror? No, I do not. Rather than nation build, we have to do smart counterterrorism, limited deployment of special forces, effective use of American air power, and yes, however problematic, relying on local forces to do the bulk of the fighting. And we will not fix this. We Americans have this notion. We have a war on poverty, a war on mental illness. We have a war on terror. We have a war on drugs. I'm hoping one day, having lost a mother to cancer, that the war on cancer will be won. But the other wars, we treat these things as if we had comprehensive solutions to all of these problems. That's not the way change happens in this country. Reinhold Niebuhr, the great Protestant theologian's view was you come up with proximate solutions to insoluble problems. And you know something? Proximate solutions, if we could get proximate solutions to insoluble problems in this country, on issues of immigration, on race, on infrastructure, on entitlement and tax reform, climate change, we'd be doing okay. But we're never going to solve these problems. At least that's what 240 years of the Republic's history seems to suggest. So if we can't do it here, what makes us think we're going to do it over there? So protecting the homeland. Number two, weaning ourselves off of Arab oil or Arab hydrocarbons. You have a North American energy revolution in this country. It has environmental consequences, to be sure, but by and large, freeing ourselves from Arab hydrocarbons is important. That doesn't mean we can forget about Middle East oil, since it trades in a single market and you disrupt the supply in country X. It has an impact in Europe and on financial markets here. So energy independence may be possible, but not energy security. So we're going to have to maintain a military presence and try to maintain relations with countries who do not share our values, like the Saudis, but who are still key to a measure of stability. And finally, we need to prevent the emergence of any single power in that region, like Iran, equipped with a nuclear weapon, who would challenge our security partners and threaten our interests. Now, I would argue to you, despite all of the disasters in this region, we aren't really doing all that badly in these three core interests. My critics argue, no, it's way too narrow. We have to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict. We have to do foreign policy as social work. We have to get involved in democracy promotion. It's not that these things are not important. What I question is our capacity to get anywhere on them, given how difficult they are and given how fraught this entire region of the world is now and is going to continue to be.
That was a fascinating hour and a sober analysis. Thanks to Aaron Miller. That piece again in Politico, if you want to see it. Member of the new president, avoid the vision thing in the Middle East. You've been listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell. If you're listening on our flagship stations, Aaron will stay with us for an overtime segment. Thanks to Aaron Miller. Thanks to our national audience for listening, and see everybody next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. You're listening to Segment 5. This is Overtime, Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Aaron Miller, former State Department official, is staying with us nicely. Let me ask you this. Trump has talked about in the campaign, maybe it's rhetoric moving the embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. You've, as you mentioned at the beginning, you were an expert in Israeli-Palestinian peace opportunities. I want to know your thoughts on that and where we ended before the importance of keeping Iran from getting a nuke. Would you is the nuke deal, though, a threat to be renegotiated by Mr. Trump?
On the Iran deal, I think there are three possible options that a Trump administration could conceivably take. One is abrogation of the accord. It's not a treaty. It's an executive agreement. Mr. Trump could essentially... It is an international agreement with other partners, but Mr. Trump sent an unmistakable signal that we were abrogating the accord, and that the U.S. was no longer going to waive the kinds of sanctions that are part of the deal. Then I think it could be over. Second is to renegotiate it, which I don't think is an option. He's not going to convene Iran and the other five powers, five members of the Security Council in Germany, basically to get together and renegotiate it. The third option is not to do anything right now, and to either allow it to be tested over time or to pass additional sanctions on Iran's other behavior in the region. Its export of terror, its production of ballistic missile technology, all of which violates certain UN Security Council resolutions, but not the actual agreement itself. And I suspect that Mr. Trump will probably, or the Trump administration will probably go to the third option, which is not to engage in a willful, highly visible act early on in the administration to abrogate the accord. So that's where I think it's going to go. I think in large measure it may be a game between Iran and the United States to see who will be perceived by the international community to have scuttled this. And that's why I think he probably will not move precipitously.
Jerusalem.
Here, every American president, at least Bill Clinton and Barack Obama during the campaign, pledged to move the embassy. The 1995 Jerusalem Embassy Act compelled the administration to move the embassy by 1999. Otherwise, half of the State Department's building authorization abroad was going to be taken away, but it provided a waiver. And every president subsequently, including George W. Bush, exercised the waiver every 6 months. So the embassy is in Tel Aviv, the consulate is in Jerusalem. There's a consulate in West Jerusalem and one that issues visas on the eastern side of the city. This is a tough one in terms of making predictions. I can only say, as recently as a week or so ago, Mr. Trump's interview in the Wall Street Journal, in which he said it would be a great honor, I think, or he had a great interest in trying to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If that is his interest, and he fashions himself to be quite the negotiator, then the last thing he wants to do is to unilaterally make a decision to move the embassy. And by the way, there are all kinds of logistical elements involved here. But he could simply, if he wanted to do it, he could simply have the American ambassador in Tel Aviv simply move into the facilities already available in the consulate as a symbolic move. I think many Israelis would welcome it. Most Palestinians, Arab states would condemn it. Whether there'd be additional violence, probably there would be. And I think it would probably, by Mr. Trump's own standards, set back any hope that he would have of resolving this conflict. If he wanted to do something for the Israelis, there are many other things that he could do and probably will do in order to improve what he believes is, has been a disastrous relationship between this Israeli prime minister and Barack Obama.
It's painful to hear because it goes against the grain of American exceptionalism.
Exactly.
We're idealists. We take on any challenge, blah,
right.
blah, blah.
Well, I have all that in mind for us here. That's and I'm not trying to invoke. There's a great quote from Lincoln in a speech he gave in 1838 to the Young Men's Lyceum, in which he basically says the following: no foreign power is ever going to drink from the waters of the Ohio River or dominate the Shenandoah Valley. The real problem is that we will be the authors of our own preservation. We will either, and he closes, he says, we will either live as free men or die by suicide. By suicide. And that notion, I think Lincoln is right. ISIS isn't going to destroy the United States. Either is Vladimir Putin or the North Koreans or Iran. And we have to keep that in mind even as we protect American interests abroad. I just don't think we have the will or the skill or the resources to go around trying to fix these regions, which are really broken and are going to remain so.
So, talking about the Israeli-Palestinian peace, two things here. One, it's no longer the prime issue in the Middle East in any way, right? So, does it deserve to be at that level? And secondly, should a president not even get involved until there's some local leaders on both sides that actually are serious about it?
I spent most of my adult life either studying this or working for a half dozen Secretary of State trying to help resolve it. And there was a time when I believed it was a seminal issue with respect to broader American interests. If the U.S. could resolve this conflict, would our credibility improve? Sure. If it was a stable resolution, would Israeli interests be served? Yes. Palestinian interests? Yes. Would the region be more stable? On this front, yes. But it's impossible to argue, given a region in full-scale meltdown, that this is an issue in which a president needs to commit the vast majority of the political and diplomatic clout that is going to be required at the moment. It is what I would call, and again, I hear my critics in the background saying he's wrong. This is really a discretionary issue for the United States.
Yeah.
Not because it isn't important, because it is not ready for prime time. And I could say to you, if we had these three things, and I will say this, if we had these three things, it would be ready for prime time. If you had leadership on both sides.
Let me ask you this, because I'm just a dumb Midwestern guy.
I doubt that.
But I look at this and I say, Israel's got one of the world's great global growth stories, high-tech stories, and I'm over across the wall there. I'm a Palestinian living in complete poverty with leadership that are terrorists and steal all the aid. And what would it take for the Palestinian folks to think, you know what, I want to be in bed with these guys over in Israel because I'll have a chance at surviving economically?
Well, your characterization, is a bit off. I think yes. I mean, we don't have to go into that, but the reality is that certainly is the perception of many. If this were an economic issue, if we could have bought this issue by putting a chicken in every pot and a computer in every home and giving people jobs and turning Gaza into Singapore and with trade and aid, I think it would have been done a long time ago. The problem is it's not a bottom line economic deal, nor is it a real estate deal in total. It is a complicated conflict driven by religion, national identity, history, and the struggle over territory. And I don't believe that if there is a resolution to this, and I sometimes wonder, even though I mentioned earlier I've abandoned my illusions, but I haven't abandoned hope. If there is a solution to this, it will have to resolve these core issues. And right now, there's absolutely no indication on either side that either side is prepared to make the choices necessary even to begin that process. And as a consequence, I suspect the incoming administration, unlike the current administration, who appointed George Mitchell as a special envoy 2 days after Barack Obama was inaugurated, I don't think that this president-elect is going to join that issue.
Do you think that we are at a point where we're at the end of a two-state solution?
I'm hesitant to make that judgment. People have argued years ago it was 5 minutes to midnight, or some people argue it was 5 minutes after midnight. It was too late. Israeli settlement on the West Bank, hardening Palestinian attitudes, Palestinian violence and terror, the Israeli occupation. I kind of, I want to believe, even though I don't want to be a sap about this, that the important facts that are standing in the way of an agreement are not on the ground, even though I recognize there are facts on the ground. But the facts that count are the ones in people's heads. And if you could fundamentally create a situation where you had leaders on both sides who really thought this was important, was prepared to condition their respective societies that it was important, and to make the kinds of choices, and then a Mandela, a de Klerk, a Sadat and a Begin, a King Hussein and a Rabin, then you might be able to imagine a serious negotiation leading to something that actually looks like the state of Israel living in peace and security alongside something called the state of Palestine. But until you have leadership, ownership, and what I would call effective mediation, you might as well hang a close for the season sign. on this one.
So what Jimmy Carter was able to do, you're saying, basically would not have happened without Sadat in particular?
What Jimmy Carter did, his relentless brokering and mediation, was a heroic effort on the part of an American president. But the reality is, you can't make bricks without straw. It required Sadat's boldness of vision, his trip to Jerusalem. It required a strong Israeli leader, Menachem Begin, who was willing to trade Sinai, even though Begin had a broader objective, which was to keep the West Bank. But to make that deal required the kind of local heroism and ownership that saw apartheid end, violating every political, historical law of gravity. There should have been no peaceful process of transition to end apartheid in South Africa. And yet Mandela and de Klerk made it possible. It speaks volumes about the critical importance of leadership. And frankly, in my judgment, having just written this book, The End of Greatness, Why America Can't Have and Doesn't Want Another Great President, that leadership deficit is not only in the Middle East. I would argue it's not only in the world. It's here too.
So let me ask that. That's a good. You talked about Carter being heroic. Nixon re-architected the world. China, Russia. President Reagan sort of won the Cold War, if you want to use those terminology. You don't think that an American president can do those kinds of architectural work anymore, or it's because we don't have the leadership to get? I
think the world has changed. I'm not one of these people who believe the world is a more dangerous place than it was 70 years ago. We have 40% fewer conflicts. We do not have the kinds of massive genocides that characterized the world over the last 70 years. We're not on the verge of a nuclear war with the Russians. Ebola killed, tragically, 13,000 people. The Spanish flu in 1919 claimed 100 million lives. 3% of the global population. The Great Recession here didn't turn into the Great Depression because we've learned some things about how to cope. But the world is more complex when it comes to how American military, economic, and political power can be deployed to fix some of these problems. And I think that is the world in which we're going to continue to live. So I think opportunities for the kind of heroic diplomacy that you identified, and the key period, of course, is 45 to 50. The end of the Second World War, the last war in this country that left America stronger at home and with more influence abroad. No war fought subsequently. In fact, all, I would argue, to some extent, with the possible exception of the First Persian Gulf War, harmed American interests. So I would argue to you that part of the reason that greatness is no longer possible in the presidency is because the opportunities, the heroic opportunities, are just fewer because the world has evolved, and in many respects it is, to some degree, more stable, but also because American power is no longer as unchallenged or as effective.
Is this an America in decline?
No, I don't buy that.
We're not too stretched militarily, financially?
Well, we're all those things. And other powers are rising, which makes our world more complex, particularly when those other powers, as you would have assumed, China and Russia in the main, have command and control operations which allow their foreign policy in many respects to be much more directed and in many respects much more effective, concentrated than ours, which is frankly and happily, however confusing and imperfect it may be, subject to the rules and principles of a certain kind of democracy. But no, I think we are, as I mentioned before, we maintain the best balance of military, political, economic, and soft power any other country in the world. Look where people put their money. Look where people come to have their open heart operations. Look where people send their kids to college. That is to say, abroad. There is this love-hate relationship with the United States, but the love part of it, or the, geez, isn't it an extraordinary place? You know, that's what I hear. I don't care what you think about the United States. People come here, and with all of our problems and all of our imperfections, they are unbelievably impressed with what we've managed to accomplish in this country.
Let me ask you this. You talked about, obviously, the war since potentially the original Gulf War have diminished American credibility in the world. You're talking, obviously, about Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Is the fundamental issue there that we have no definition of what a win is?
It's that, first of all, I think it's a problem with trying to understand what it is military power is designed to achieve, and how to deploy it and use it in a way that is least costly from the standpoint of expenditure of American lives, and most effective. I mean, World War II was the last good war, quote unquote, however horrific it was. I mean, the cause of the war was beyond. We were attacked. Victory was total. Just to give you one example, we occupied Japan from 1945 to 1952, 7 years. All right, how many Americans do you think were killed on the Japanese mainland in hostile actions by the Japanese during that 7-year period? None.
Wow.
Not one. So I asked myself, and I was in government in January of 2003, what were we thinking? Even in the wake of 9/11, when we invaded a country roughly the size of the state of California population-wise, with insufficient forces, I mentioned earlier, woeful misunderstanding of Iraq's political geography, stripping away the Ba'ath Party, dismantling the military. What did we want to achieve?
Yeah.
What did we expect we would have achieved? So the standard for victory became not could we transform Iraq, because we couldn't, but when could we leave? And although leaving was a part of all of our wars, even our most successful ones, it's what you left behind that counted. And you cannot repair the kinds of problems that confront these societies, no matter how well-intentioned you may be.
Fascinating. I thought it might be fun to end the last couple of minutes. You've worked with several Secretary of States, and you've mentioned Kissinger and Baker. There's also been Madeleine Albright, Colin Powell, George Shultz, Hillary Clinton, and maybe not ask you to criticize them, but maybe some positive attributes of some of these folks as you see it.
I mean, I think all of them. And I didn't work for Hillary Clinton, although I spent some time with her when she was First Lady, when I was at the State Department. And I didn't work for John Kerry. But all of the men and women, the one woman that I worked for, were extraordinary, each in their own right. You know, I argue that the Secretary of State is the second best job in Washington. Second best job in Washington, I would argue, for me, for example, I would conceive it as the best job. Because in many respects, even though the appointees are in part compatible with the politics of a president, they must be, it is not a political job. I mean, Baker wrote his memoir called The Politics of Diplomacy, and he made the point that diplomacy is political. Well, of course it is at home. But the Secretary of State is perceived to be, in many respects, above politics. And that infuses the defense of the national interest. Politics stops at the water's edge, the famous phrase. But to a degree, it's really true. When you travel with a Secretary of State, and you get off that United States of America plane, and you enter a foreign country, there's a real sense that politics in many respects is diffused. And you're there to promote the national interests of the United States of America. I'll give you an example. I run a foreign policy school at the Wilson Center for congressional staff. It's 4 years old. We bring 50 Republican and Democratic staffers twice a year to talk to them about foreign policy. But the second hour, we divide the R's and D's up into groups, House and Senate, Republican and Democrat. And we give them problems to resolve. And an amazing thing happens. No matter what their political party, when they're talking about foreign policy, these young staffers who do amazing work, consequential work, staff makes Congress run. They want to be smart, and they posit their approaches in the context of what makes sense and what's smart for America. It's an extraordinary demonstration of how foreign policy can, under certain circumstances, create a degree of bipartisanship. And that's what most impressed me about the men and women that I worked for. Yeah, they had different political views. But once in that job, they were there to defend the interests of the United States. They were there not as D's and not as R's. They were there as Americans with a capital A. And frankly, without moralizing or editorializing, that's what we need today. I sometimes remark that the line for domestic and foreign policy in this country should not be between left and right, nor should it be between liberal and conservative, nor should it be between Republican and Democrat. The line for this country should be between smart and dumb. And the only question that you should ask is, which side of the line do you want America to be on? If you want it to be on the smart side, then there are certain things each of us can do. You don't demonize your opponents. When you talk to someone in conversation, someone with whom you profoundly disagree, you don't spend the time while they're talking trying to figure out your talking points about how you're going to rebut what they say. You listen to them. You listen to them on the off chance that something they say may well be able to advance a solution that both of you could agree with. You don't get your news from one news source. I mean, there are days I've appeared on CNN, Fox, and MSNBC on the same day. You don't have your prejudices validated by going to news sources that validate them. You reach out in an effort to get your information from a variety of different sources. You practice civility in the true sense of the word as well. So, I mean, we need more of this. This is not a Republican message. It's not a Democratic message. I work for R's and D's. I voted for R's and D's. It's a message, I think, right now, particularly now, that we need to understand. You know, Peggy Noonan wrote a wonderful piece in the Wall Street Journal this week on how to talk to your kids. She's a Reagan enthusiast. She argues in the piece quite a striking conversation with Donald Trump on the phone. And it's worth reading the article just to see her impressions of Trump, who she castigated during the campaign. But she said something very disturbing. She said, it's not that we can't come together. The real question is, do we want to come together? And that question is one that haunts me and worries me. You know, we've been through a lot in this country. Yes, red and blue is terrible. We are a divided country, but we've been through blue and gray. And I think if we got through blue and gray, we can get through this too. But we need to try in a way that's open and inclusive and respectful.
Wow, what a way to end it. That was a great ending. Thanks again to Aaron Miller. That piece in Politico, again, is Memo to the New President, Avoid the Vision Thing in the Middle East. Thanks again to Aaron for staying with us on Overtime. See everybody again next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell.